6 cops were laid out bleeding, and one young man was slipping through the Bronx night with a graze across his head. Sirens screamed from every direction, but somehow he was gone, leaving the city stunned and the department embarrassed. 6 officers hit, and one man still breathing was something no one expected to see. For the block, it sounded like payback, but for police, it was humiliation written in blood. The streets started whispering his name heavy that night, but the story had barely started. This was not the ending. This was the beginning of Larry Davis's legend. Larry Davis was born on May 28, 1966 in South Carolina, before his family packed up and moved north into New York. The Davises landed in the Bronx, settling in the High Bridge section, a tough pocket not far from Yankee Stadium, where projects leaned against cracked sidewalks. His family was huge, with some reports saying 12 kids and others counting closer to 18. His father bounced out when Larry was around 10 years old, leaving his mother Mary Davis with a full house and heavy pressure. That shaped Larry early, because when the man of the house left, the street stepped in to raise the boys. High Bridge, during the mid-70s and early 80s, was no playground for kids trying to stay straight. Burned buildings dotted the skyline, heroin lingered, and when crack later hit, it twisted the borough even tighter. The Davis family was just one of many struggling to keep food on the table while sirens sang through the night. Larry was like many young dudes in the neighborhood, switching between being a normal kid and hustling just to keep sneakers on his feet. People close to him remembered he always carried an energy that stood out, even when he had little in his pockets. Music was where Larry really tried to build his name before the rest of the world knew him for something else. He could play instruments, he had an ear for beats, and he kept a passion for production that showed even as a teenager. He set up small makeshift studios between Manhattan and the Bronx, cutting tracks and mixing tapes for local talent. Neighbors remembered him spinning at schoolyard parties, pulling crowds with his turntables, and even making appearances on local Bronx cable music shows. His friends swore he was trying to build a career in hip-hop long before rap reached mainstream television. But being creative did not erase the reality of the Bronx during that time. The mid-'80s were a storm where crack money flooded blocks. Stick-up crews flourished, and hustlers were seen as neighborhood kings. Larry was drawn into it, just like so many other kids from broken homes who were forced to choose between hunger or hustle. Police files showed that by 1980, he already had juvenile arrests on record for property crimes, and by 1984, he had a robbery conviction followed by a weapons charge. He violated probation not long after, so law enforcement already knew his name before the shootout ever made him infamous. Still, people who knew him did not paint him only as another Bronx stick-up kid. They remembered a young man who hated what drugs had done to his own family. One of his sisters fell deep into addiction, and it hurt him to watch her fall apart. His girlfriend's cocaine habit led to a miscarriage in 1986, leaving him devastated and angry at the same culture he once dabbled in. That tragedy hit hard enough that friends later said it pushed him away from dealing drugs completely. He even said in his own words, "My message is for young people to stay away from drugs," trying to separate himself from the destruction crack had brought. The streets, however, were never simple enough to let you walk away clean once you got involved. Larry may have wanted to cut ties with hustling, but he was already tied to the codes and the circles that lived and breathed on those corners. By the mid-'80s, High Bridge and the wider South Bronx were heavy with drug crews battling for territory. Every corner was pressed, every building staircase carried its own danger, and stepping outside meant risking running into enemies or police. You had to know who to nod at, who to ignore, and when to keep your head down. Larry grew sharper in that world because survival required it. His time bouncing between music studios and neighborhood hangouts kept him in 2 different lanes. Some days he was trying to push records and impress local rappers. Other days, he was caught in the pull of street business. He was not heavily tattooed or flaunting gang colors, but he was definitely part of that Bronx rhythm where every young man felt forced to juggle dreams and survival. The cops already had him on their list, and hustlers already knew his face, so whether he wanted it or not, he was a player in the game. By the mid-'80s, the Bronx was cooking heavy, not just beats on block parties, but also crack pipes lighting hallways and hand-to-hand sales on corners. If you were outside, you had to pick a lane. Either you played music and prayed it paid, or you stepped into the hustle and risked your freedom. Larry tried to play both at once, and that split life set the stage for everything that came after. By the time Larry was moving around the Bronx with music gear and guns, whispers started building heavy on his name. Folks in High Bridge were saying he was not just another corner hustler, but somebody tied into something deeper. The story went that when Larry was just 15, he and a friend got stopped while riding dirt bikes around the Bronx blocks. Instead of the usual ticket or beatdown, the cops told them to start moving crack for them. These were not random uniforms either. They were said to be detectives from the 44th Precinct, a place known on the street as Fort Apache. That nickname Fort Apache was not just some Hollywood label, It was earned through years of aggressive policing and dirty business. People in the Bronx already saw that precinct as its own world, with officers known for bending rules whenever they wanted. The claim was that these cops forced Larry and his friend into the crack trade, telling them exactly where to move product and when. According to his lawyers and his family, Larry never volunteered to become a dealer. He got pushed into the role by officers who wanted another young runner on the block. As the story spread, it got more detailed, saying the officers protected Larry's crew from raids and gave him guns. People close to him repeated that he bragged about weapons coming directly from cops, not just street connects. He was supposedly allowed to hold down spots while police turned their eyes away. Word was they collected a cut of the profits, pocketing money on top of their city salaries. In the mid-'80s, the crack game was printing cash, and dirty cops were always circling the money like sharks. Larry himself later doubled down on those claims when the spotlight was on him. During his surrender, surrounded by cameras and cops, he shouted out loud, "The cops gave me the guns." That statement stuck forever because it was bold and dangerous to say in front of the whole city. It was not just a young man trying to dodge charges, it was someone pointing directly at the NYPD in public. Once those words left his mouth, his entire case carried a different energy. His lawyers, William Kunstler and Lynn Stewart, pushed that line hard when they defended him. Kunstler especially knew how to stir headlines, and he told reporters, "Any black guy that shoots 6 cops and puts the fear of God in police officers, I think is great." That statement was wild, but it fit with how Kunstler saw the trial. He wanted the jury to see Larry not as a wild shooter, but as somebody fighting back against corruption. Back then, in 1986, most people outside the Bronx thought the whole story sounded like a conspiracy theory. Officials dismissed it quick, saying Larry was lying to save himself from the weight of multiple murder charges. Newspapers like the New York Times covered his words, but treated them with heavy skepticism. Police unions told the public it was nonsense, branding him as nothing more than a violent criminal trying to blame his crimes on the badge. For mainstream readers, the thought of NYPD detectives giving guns to a teenager was unbelievable. But in the Bronx, plenty of people believed him because they already saw things that outsiders ignored. People remembered detectives running down number spots and pocketing cash or looking the other way while certain crews sold drugs untouched. Larry's claim about Fort Apache cops moving crack was not so wild to neighbors who lived through raids and shakedowns every month. When Kunstler put those claims in court filings, it gave Bronx residents something they recognized from their own daily lives. Years later, the Mullen Commission dropped heavy receipts about police corruption in New York. That investigation in the early 90s uncovered entire precincts involved in extortion, stealing drugs, and selling crack on the side. Officers like Michael Dowd from the 75th Precinct were caught openly running with the drug dealers. Those findings made people revisit Larry's words with new eyes. Suddenly, his statement, "The cops gave me the guns," did not feel like crazy talk anymore. The Mullen Commission proved that NYPD had long rosters of officers playing both sides of the game. Detectives extorted dealers, robbed stash houses, and sold the same drugs back onto the street. They covered up shootings, framed suspects, and took cash payoffs with no shame. For Bronx residents who already distrusted police, the commission was a late confirmation of what they already suspected for years. That added weight to Larry's version of events, even if nobody could prove his specific claims in court. Larry's family repeated the same story whenever they were interviewed. His mother, Mary Davis, said her son was being targeted because he knew too much about officers hustling crack. His sisters backed it up, saying he always told them cops had threatened his life because he stopped working for them. The defense painted him as a pawn who tried to step away from the system and almost got killed for it. When Larry told his sister Regina he kept stashing guns because police were coming for him, that fear matched the story about dirty officers protecting their secrets. Public opinion split around those rumors, and the division stayed sharp. On one side, police officers and their supporters said it was all fiction. They saw Larry as nothing but a dangerous criminal who pulled the trigger on 6 officers and tried to talk his way out. On the other side, plenty of Bronx residents whispered that Larry knew exactly which cops were dirty, and that was the real reason so many detectives stormed his sister's apartment without a warrant. By the late 80s, graffiti started showing his name in hallways, and t-shirts carried slogans like "Free Larry Davis." Some people in the hood called him a folk hero because he was seen as standing up against the same officers who harassed them daily. Others were cautious, not willing to celebrate someone tied to murders, but they admitted his words about dirty cops rang true. The rumors turned Larry into something bigger than just another Bronx hustler. It is important to remember that none of those claims about police collaboration were proven in court. No detective was formally charged with running Larry or arming him, but the Mullen Commission years later made people rethink the possibility. And for Larry, those rumors kept him from being seen as just another stick-up kid. They made his story part of a bigger fight about corruption in the NYPD. Larry's legend grew heavy because he was not only accused of violence, but also painted himself as somebody with dirt on officers. Once his lawyers repeated it and his family vouched for it, the streets carried that story like gospel. People said if the cops wanted him dead so bad, it must be because he held secrets they did not want exposed. That shaped his image forever, leaving him suspended between two worlds. Larry Davis was not remembered as just another hustler who caught charges. He became the guy who claimed he had cops in his pocket before they turned on him. He was the young man who told reporters, "The cops gave me the guns," while 6 officers healed in hospitals. For the Bronx in the mid-'80s, those words mattered more than any court testimony. They reflected a truth the community already felt, even if nobody in power wanted to admit it. By the summer of 1986, Larry Davis was moving through a Bronx where crack ruled everything. The game was ruthless, and it was not just hustlers on corners, it was whole networks battling. Larry was already known to police for robberies, and soon his name became linked with murders. On August 5, 1986, Bronx dealer Raymond Vizcaino got killed during what authorities called a robbery attempt. The shooting happened on Webster Avenue, with witnesses claiming armed men tried to force entry into his apartment. Vizcaino was shot through a door, left dead in a pile of blood, shocking his neighborhood. Investigators quickly suspected Davis and his older brother Eddie of being involved in the attempted robbery. Police files later tied both men to that Webster Avenue incident through informants and ballistic tests. It was not just about Vizcaino though, because more blood spilled as the summer turned into fall. The Bronx drug trade was full of paranoia and betrayals, and Larry's name kept appearing when people got shot. Detectives began watching him closer, convinced he was behind multiple violent robberies, targeting dealers across the borough. By September 16th, another drug man was killed, this time in Harlem. Victor Lagambra, sometimes written as Lagambra, was shot inside an apartment after robbers stormed in looking for cash and product. Witnesses said Lagambra surprised the crew during the robbery, and shots rang out before he fell to the floor dead. Police later claimed the bullet that killed him matched a .32 caliber revolver connected to Larry Davis. It was the second body linked to his name in just over a month. Then came October 30th, 1986, a night that turned whispers into loud alarms across New York. 4 young dealers identified as Angel Castro, Juan Rodriguez, Jesus Perez, and Hector Figueroa Hernandez were found executed in a Bronx apartment. Each one had been lined up and shot in the head, leaving a scene described as cold-blooded execution style. It shocked even hardened Bronx cops, who had seen plenty of killings during the height of the crack wars. That quadruple homicide, later called the Bronx Apartment Massacre, became one of the most infamous cases of that year. Investigators quickly suspected Larry Davis because a pistol tied to him showed ballistic matches to the crime scene shells. The weapon was later recovered from him, linking him directly to the killings in official police reports. If true, it meant Davis carried out an execution of 4 men in one night. But the streets told a more complicated story when people talked about the Bronx Massacre. Some residents whispered that Larry was not just killing for profit, but striking against crack dealers, poisoning his neighborhood. His sister was hooked on drugs, and his girlfriend's miscarriage was blamed on cocaine use. So some said revenge fueled him. In that telling, he was a vigilante cleaning corners by eliminating those who sold poison. Others were not buying that image, saying he was just another ruthless competitor removing rivals to secure money and power. To police, the story was simple. He was a violent young man eliminating dealers to gain respect. But in the Bronx, perception mattered more than facts, and Larry's reputation grew every time another dealer turned up dead. People debated whether he was a protector or just another hustler with no limits. On that same day, October 30th, police clashed with him in an incident that raised the pressure even higher. A man named Roy Gray reported to police that Davis had robbed him earlier that week. On October 30th, Gray spotted Larry preparing to rob cocaine dealers in Harlem and flagged down nearby officers. Gray even rode with police in pursuit as they chased a van carrying Davis and 2 associates. The chase tore through Manhattan streets into the Bronx, eventually reaching Jerome Avenue, where the crew ditched the van. Shots were fired from the vehicle during the pursuit, with police returning fire in a running exchange. Davis and his crew slipped into a Bronx building, vanishing into the maze of High Bridge apartments. Ballistic shells collected from that chase were later matched to a pistol tied to Davis. That same pistol linked back to the Bronx Apartment Massacre earlier that night. The Jerome Avenue shootout made it official for police that Davis was connected to multiple violent felonies in one day. The combination of 4 murders, a robbery attempt, and firing on officers painted him as a major threat. But despite those events, no immediate arrest warrant was issued, a detail that raised questions later in court. Investigators claimed they were gathering evidence, but critics believe police wanted to take him down off the books. By early November, the hunt for Davis was getting more intense as murders piled up and public pressure mounted. Detectives in the Bronx tied him to as many as 6 killings, and his name spread through precinct chatter. He was painted as the face of Bronx violence, a young man suspected of being a serial executioner. That reputation set the stage for the heavy police raid that would soon end in chaos. Inside his family homes, Larry was already talking like a man marked for death. His sister Regina Lewis later told reporters he came to her apartment with guns and paranoia. He explained to her, "If I'm caught in the street, the police are going to shoot me, but I'm going to shoot them first." Those words captured his mindset in those weeks before the shootout. He believed police were preparing to kill him instead of arresting him. Whether that belief was paranoia or survival instinct is still debated, but the tension was clear. Officers were already threatening his family, with his mother Mary Davis testifying that police pushed her and warned her son would be killed. Larry responded by rotating hideouts, carrying heavy weapons, and keeping his guard up every time he stepped outside. The robberies and killings had given him enemies on both sides. Dealers wanted him gone, and police wanted him in cuffs. By the middle of November, his world was closing in, and he knew something was about to explode. The Bronx streets buzzed with talk about his name, some admiring him, some scared, and others waiting for him to fall. With murders stacked on his record and a shootout already behind him, the pressure on Larry Davis was reaching its breaking point. By early November 1986, the walls were closing in tight around Larry Davis in the Bronx. Police were convinced he had blood on his hands from murders and robberies, and detectives were ready to end the chase. On the street level, people whispered that cops did not want him taken alive. They wanted him silenced. That sense of inevitability made every move dangerous, and Larry felt it more than anyone else. His family started noticing just how heavy the pressure was becoming as officers began harassing them directly. His mother, Mary Davis, testified later that 2 weeks before the famous shootout, police stormed her home. She said an officer pushed her and told her flat out that they were going to kill Larry. Mary was shaken enough to file a complaint with the Civilian Complaint Review Board, and the board actually sustained it. That meant the threat was real, documented, and officially acknowledged in city records. For Larry, that was confirmation of everything he already feared. He stopped living at his own spot and moved between different relatives' homes, never staying too long anywhere. Most nights he crashed at his sister's apartments, where children and family members lived in cramped conditions. He kept stashing guns in those spaces, sometimes to the frustration of his siblings who did not want the heat. His sister, Regina Lewis, said she once confronted him about leaving weapons around her home, where kids played. Larry told her calmly, "If I'm caught in the street, the police are going to shoot me, but I'm going to shoot them first." That statement summed up his reality, a man convinced his only chance was fighting back. The paranoia spread into his behavior because he knew every sound outside might be a raid. He rotated weapons constantly, carrying pistols and keeping extra clips near windows and beds. He had a .45 caliber pistol and a .32 revolver, both weapons later tied to serious crimes. His family saw him moving with tension in his shoulders, like somebody who already knew his ending was coming. Some relatives tried to convince him to turn himself in, but he believed that meant guaranteed death. Neighbors in the Bronx also felt the tension, watching patrol cars circle and detectives sitting on corners. The name Larry Davis was buzzing in bodegas and staircases, with people saying the cops wanted his head. Some called him a folk hero for standing up against drug dealers and maybe dirty officers. Others said he was finished because no one could wound 6 officers and expect forgiveness. Either way, the Bronx was waiting for the next headline, and everyone sensed it was close. Larry's routine became unpredictable because unpredictability was his shield against capture. He would show up at Regina's Fulton Avenue apartment late at night and leave before sunrise. Sometimes he stayed with another sister a few blocks away, moving like a shadow between family spots. Each visit carried the same weight because behind those apartment doors was a man preparing for war. He was 20 years old but living like a soldier under siege in his own city. The police were tightening their net, and every officer involved carried frustration and rage. The department had already been embarrassed after the Jerome Avenue chase and the whispers of his murders. They wanted to bring him down, and the talk on the street was that they would not settle for handcuffs. By mid-November, everyone in Highbridge and Morrisania was bracing for something violent, like waiting for thunder after lightning. That sense of inevitability pointed straight to one address, 1231 Fulton Avenue, where Regina Lewis lived with her family. It was a regular Bronx apartment filled with kids, relatives, and daily chaos, but it became Larry's last hideout. He carried guns into that space, convinced he was safer around family than in the open. But in reality, that apartment was about to turn into the center of New York's most infamous raid. By the middle of November 1986, everyone around Larry Davis felt the tension in the air heavy. Police were desperate to catch him, detectives were angry about his name on multiple murder files, and the streets whispered about an execution coming. That pressure finally boiled over on November 19, 1986, inside his sister Regina Lewis's apartment on Fulton Avenue in the Morrisania section of the Bronx. Regina lived in a modest ground floor unit with her husband Victor Gonzalez and her 2 young kids. On that night, the place was full of family, with Larry inside along with his brother Gene, Chip Davis, and 2 family friends. The apartment was crowded, kids running around, and no one expecting the walls to explode with violence. Larry was laying low there because he trusted his sister's space more than the corners outside. Police had already tracked him to that address through tips and surveillance, and they moved with numbers that showed their intentions. That night, around 27 officers rolled up, including members of the Emergency Service Unit, detectives from the 41st Precinct, and backup scattered around the block. It was not a quiet arrest. It looked more like a military operation staged for war. The streets outside filled with flashing lights, while officers positioned themselves to surround the building completely. The most important detail that night was that police did not carry an arrest warrant. They had not secured one in time, but they decided to move anyway, claiming they wanted to question him. Officers later said the raid was about picking him up for multiple murders, but critics saw it as a hit squad. They moved in heavy, knowing the target was armed and expecting something deadly. Around 8:45 p.m., 9 officers entered Regina's apartment building and approached the small unit where Larry was staying. Inside, family members had no warning before the door was pushed and officers stormed in carrying shotguns and pistols. One of the first through the door was Detective John O'Hara from the ESU, holding a shotgun pointed forward. The space was narrow, rooms small, kids present, and panic erupted in seconds. Gunfire started almost immediately after the officers entered the living room area. Accounts differ on who fired first, but once bullets started flying, everything turned into chaos. Larry was armed with a .45 caliber pistol and possibly a .32 revolver, and he fired off shots in the tight space. Officers fired back with shotguns and pistols, filling the apartment with deafening sound, smoke, and screams from terrified children. Within seconds, 6 officers were down, bleeding from gunshot wounds that came fast in the confusion. Detective O'Hara was struck in the mouth. Another officer, Thomas McCarran, took a bullet to the neck, and Officer John O'Connell was hit in the arm. 3 other officers went down with injuries to arms and legs, stunned that one man had just leveled an entire entry squad. The firefight was so frantic that some officers later believed they might have been hit by friendly fire. Later lawsuits filed by injured officers claimed the NYPD bungled the raid badly. They said poor coordination caused officers to fire into each other during the crossfire in such a small apartment. Ballistics were never fully clear about which bullets came from Larry and which came from other officers. Either way, the reality was undeniable. 6 cops were shot in less than a minute, and the suspect was still alive. Larry himself was hit, but only grazed. A shotgun blast tore across the side of his head, cutting his scalp but not stopping him. Blood streamed down his face, but adrenaline pushed him forward as he searched for an exit. The fact that the graze did not kill him became another piece of his growing legend in the Bronx. Amid the smoke and screams, Larry slipped out, moving through the back room toward another part of the building. He pushed into the adjacent apartment, which belonged to another sister, and from there he found a way out. Some reports said he crashed through a window. Others said he moved quietly into the hallway. Either way, he escaped the raid, leaving 6 officers wounded inside the apartment. Outside the building, dozens of officers were stationed, supposedly forming a perimeter. But when Larry came running, bleeding from his head, they missed him in the darkness. Residents were pouring out of the building in panic, kids crying, mothers shouting, and in that confusion, Larry melted into the crowd. He vanished into the night, a 20-year-old man who had just taken on an army of police and survived. The NYPD was left humiliated. 27 officers had surrounded the building. 6 were down, and their suspect was gone. The department scrambled to contain the embarrassment, while the press rushed to report the story. Within hours, New York tabloids carried front-page headlines about the man who shot 6 officers and escaped. The story shocked the city because nobody had ever humiliated the police like that before. Journalist Barry Michael Cooper later described the moment as the birth of an urban legend. He called Larry Davis a Black Billy the Kid, saying he was an adolescent gunslinger who outshot an entire task force. That description captured how the Bronx started to see him, not just as another suspect, but as someone rewriting the rules of the street. On the block, People told the story with the street slang that carried pride. One dude, two burners, and he made the biggest police squad in New York backpedal, was how residents put it. In the Bronx, the image of a young man escaping a wall of cops was powerful. Some said it proved the system could be beaten, even if only for a night. For police, it was humiliation and rage. Officers sat in hospitals with bandages and scars, while colleagues swore revenge. Police Commissioner Benjamin Ward publicly promised Davis would be caught, while officers on the street vowed he would not survive. The mood inside the department was fury, because no one wanted to admit they had been outgunned. The public split immediately, with newspapers framing Davis as a monster, while neighborhoods debated his legend. To many New Yorkers, he was a dangerous criminal who shot 6 cops in front of children. To many Bronx residents, he was someone who stood up when cops moved reckless and without warrants. That division would shape every headline and every trial that followed, because Larry Davis became more than a suspect. He became a symbol. That night of November 19, 1986, changed New York forever. 6 wounded officers, 1 wounded fugitive, and a whole city forced to ask questions about police power. Larry Davis disappeared into the streets, but his name was now burned into history. The Bronx shootout was not just another case. It was the moment when a young man turned into both a criminal and a folk hero, depending on who you asked. The night Larry Davis slipped out of Fulton Avenue with blood running down his head, the city went into shock. 6 cops were in hospitals, and the man who shot them was loose somewhere in the Bronx. Police cars roared through the streets with sirens blasting, and every news station carried the story before midnight. For the NYPD, this was humiliation on the biggest stage, and they wanted him found quick. By the morning of November 20th, 1986, the NYPD had already launched one of the largest manhunts in city history. Police Commissioner Benjamin Ward ordered hundreds of officers onto the case, and they spread through every borough. Detectives raided apartments, tapped phones, and leaned on every known associate of Larry Davis. They put up a $15,000 reward for information, hoping money would make somebody talk. Flyers with his face hit corners fast, and the department made it clear they would not rest until he was in custody. Larry, however, did not run far. He stayed right in the city, slipping between Bronx blocks and sometimes crossing into Harlem. He survived because he had a network of family and friends who gave him shelter. One night he would sleep on a couch in a cousin's apartment, then vanish before sunrise. Another night he would hide in a friend's basement, eating whatever they gave him before disappearing again. People who helped him later said he moved like a shadow, never staying too long anywhere. His survival also depended on the sympathy of ordinary Bronx residents. Plenty of people hated police during that period, especially after cases like Eleanor Bumpers and Michael Stewart. Bumpers, a 66-year-old grandmother, had been shot to death by NYPD officers during an eviction in 1984. Stewart, a young graffiti artist, died in 1983 after being beaten by transit police. These cases left scars in the city's memory, and many residents saw Larry's story through that lens. To them, he was not just a fugitive. He was somebody fighting a system already seen as brutal. But the police responded with raw aggression. They raided homes of anyone linked to Larry, often without warrants or explanations. One of his friends, writing later under the name Shams, said detectives beat people who refused to give up information. Shams claimed one officer, known on the street as Crazy Joe, broke a man's leg for not cooperating. Word spread fast that police were wilding out, and it scared people who even mentioned Larry's name. If you were seen as close to him, you risked a beating or worse. Despite the pressure, the network around him kept helping because they believed the cops wanted him dead. Some friends gave him cash, some gave him food, and others simply offered a couch for a few hours. He shaved his head at one point to change his look, and rumors said he even dressed as a woman once to slip by checkpoints. Nobody could confirm every disguise, but the rumors made him sound untouchable. On walls across the Bronx, graffiti started popping up that read, "Run Larry Run." Kids sprayed it in staircases. Teenagers tagged it on rooftops, and the words carried through neighborhoods. It became a chant for those rooting for him, even as police patrols stormed through those same blocks. To the cops, he was a ghost. To the block, he was a headline walking, the living story that everybody wanted to repeat. The tension in the city only grew heavier because the Howard Beach incident happened in the same period. On December 20th, 1986, just weeks after the shootout, a black man named Michael Griffith was chased by a white mob in Queens and killed by a car. That racially charged case reminded people of the dangerous divide in New York. Against that backdrop, Larry's escape looked to some like payback for years of police brutality and racist violence. Rumors about him got crazier with each passing day, blurring fact and myth until nobody knew the difference. Some stories claimed he had cash stashed away from robbing dealers and was using it to buy safety. Others swore he never slept in the same place twice, always moving like smoke through stairwells. The most bizarre rumor said he cooked and ate a Chihuahua dog while hiding out, a story repeated by terrified relatives. Another claim said he ordered a killing inside a crowded van because he wanted more space to escape. These wild tales spread through newspapers and street gossip, turning him into both monster and legend at the same time. For the NYPD, the embarrassment was personal. They were already furious that 6 officers were wounded, and every day without catching him felt like another insult. Officers stormed into apartments with rifles ready, sometimes tearing through homes only to find nothing. The media captured photos of raids, showing battered doors and angry families claiming innocence. Community activists pointed at the raids as proof the department was using the manhunt to punish entire neighborhoods. Larry's myth grew with each failure to catch him. Journalists described him as a ghost running circles around the largest police force in America. Residents told stories of spotting him on corners, but police always arriving just after he slipped away. He seemed untouchable, even though he was just 20 years old, bleeding from a shotgun graze and relying on scraps. Every time he vanished, his legend got bigger because nobody believed one man could embarrass the NYPD for so long. What made his run even more legendary was how visible he stayed without getting caught. He was not hiding in another state or country. He was moving through the same blocks where everybody knew his face. The Bronx staircases and Harlem apartments became his shield because neighbors hated the police enough to keep him hidden. The NYPD had helicopters in the air, hundreds of officers on the ground, and still they could not bring him in. The chase lasted for 17 days, but it felt longer to everyone involved. Every day the newspapers wrote updates. Every night the television news led with his name. To the city, it was like watching a movie play out in real time. To the police, it was the most frustrating manhunt of the decade. And to the Bronx, it was a mix of pride, fear, and suspense, as one of their own kept running against impossible odds. When the chase finally ended, Larry Davis was still alive, proving his survival instincts were stronger than anyone expected. But those 17 days cemented his reputation in New York. He was no longer just a suspect, he was a symbol. Some called him a killer who needed to be caged. Others called him a fighter who stood up against a dirty system. Either way, by the end of the manhunt, Larry Davis was a legend walking, and the city would never forget his name. After 17 long days on the run, the manhunt for Larry Davis finally closed in. On December 5, 1986, police tracked him to the Twin Parks West housing project on Webster Avenue in the Bronx. That was only a few blocks from where everything started, proving he had never left the city. He had been moving through friends' apartments in the complex, but this time officers got a tip that stuck. By late that night, the building was surrounded by a massive show of force. NYPD units locked down the area with rifles, while emergency service officers took positions near stairwells. FBI agents arrived too, because the case had grown too big for just the local police. Helicopters hovered overhead with spotlights flashing against the high-rise windows. Hundreds of people in the neighborhood gathered outside, watching the spectacle unfold in the cold Bronx night. Inside the apartment, Larry Davis was cornered with the family caught in the middle. Reports later said he claimed to have hostages, but the details remain messy. Some said he forced his way in. Others believed the family was sympathetic. Either way, the NYPD negotiators quickly got him on the phone and tried to bring him out. Davis answered the call directly, his voice calm but firm as he laid out his conditions. He told them he would not surrender unless the FBI was involved, not just the NYPD. He also demanded the media be present because he feared officers would kill him if no cameras were around. His third demand was a guarantee of safety, meaning he wanted to walk out alive and unharmed. Those demands showed how deep his distrust of the NYPD ran and how much he believed his life was at risk. The standoff stretched overnight, with police and FBI trying to keep the situation calm. Negotiators cycled in shifts, speaking through the phone and sometimes through the peephole of the apartment door. Davis told them repeatedly that the police wanted him dead and that only the FBI could guarantee fairness. He reminded them of his earlier claim, saying he had been armed by corrupt cops. For him, surrendering without conditions meant signing his own death certificate. Crowds outside the building waited all night, chanting his name and trading stories. The scene felt more like a block party than a police operation at times. Kids shouted, "Larry, Larry," while adults stood watching with mixed emotions. Some wanted him to come out safe. Others shook their heads at the chaos he brought. But everyone knew they were witnessing history in real time, something the Bronx would talk about forever. By the early morning hours of December 6th, the breakthrough finally came. Negotiators convinced Davis that his demands would be honored. The FBI would take the lead, and cameras were already on site rolling. Police Commissioner Benjamin Ward and other top brass stood nearby, prepared to claim victory once he stepped out. Tactical units waited in position, ready to storm the building if anything went wrong. Then, in front of flashing lights and TV crews, Larry Davis made his move. He allowed the family inside the apartment to leave first, showing he would not harm innocents. Then he walked out calmly, wearing a black leather jacket, his hands visible and steady. He looked directly into the cameras as he stepped into the open courtyard, with hundreds of officers pointing rifles at him. The scene was unforgettable. With spotlights blazing and helicopters circling overhead, residents leaned from windows chanting, "Larry, Larry," as the young fugitive walked calmly toward custody. He did not duck his head like most suspects. He held it high and faced the cameras. His eyes looked dazed but determined, a mix of exhaustion and defiance. The image became one of the most iconic moments of 1980s New York. Before he was placed in the police van, Davis shouted his most famous line, "The cops gave me the guns," he declared, loud enough for reporters and bystanders to hear. That statement cut through the night like a blade, accusing the NYPD of arming him for the drug trade. It was the same claim his lawyers had pushed, but now he said it himself in front of cameras. Those words became the opening act for his courtroom battles that followed. For officers on the scene, the surrender was both relief and humiliation. They finally had him alive in custody, but only after 17 days of national embarrassment. For the Bronx crowd, the surrender was a spectacle, half carnival and half political statement. Some cheered for him like he was a champion. Others whispered that his time was over. Either way, the energy around his surrender made it unforgettable. Larry Davis walked out calm, unhurt, and still defiant, even with dozens of rifles pointed at him. That image split the city in two, turning him into either a folk hero or a criminal spectacle. Supporters saw a young man standing tall against overwhelming force, while critics saw a dangerous shooter enjoying undeserved applause. The truth lay somewhere between, but perception mattered more than facts at that moment. That surrender ended the manhunt, but started the bigger battle that would play out in courtrooms. His walk into custody showed the world he was alive, ready to tell his story. For the Bronx, it was another chapter in a saga that already felt larger than life. Larry Davis's first trial came in March 1988 for the Bronx apartment massacre. Prosecutors said Davis executed 4 dealers inside an apartment on October 30th, 1986. They presented ballistic evidence from a .45 caliber pistol tied to him by detectives. They also brought in eyewitness Roy Gray, who said Davis bragged about hitting the spot. Gray was the same man who rode with police during the Jerome Avenue chase earlier that night. The defense countered with a Florida alibi, saying Davis was out of the city when those murders happened. They also hinted the NYPD planted ballistic evidence, painting the case as another frame-up. Kunstler and Stewart attacked the credibility of Gray, calling him unreliable and motivated by self-interest. After weeks of testimony, the jury returned a verdict of not guilty on all charges. The decision shocked prosecutors and embarrassed the NYPD, who saw the case as their strongest. For Davis, it was the first of several high-profile victories that made him look untouchable. Later that year, Davis faced the trial everyone had been waiting for, the shooting of 6 police officers. The courtroom in the Bronx was packed daily, with wounded cops sitting in the front rows. Their bandages were gone, but the scars and anger were still fresh on their faces. Officers filled the gallery, glaring at Davis while their families demanded justice. The prosecution's case was straightforward, painting Davis as a violent fugitive who opened fire on police. They showed photos of wounded officers and read testimony from men who took bullets that night. Detective John O'Hara told the jury how buckshot tore into his face, nearly costing him his life. Officer Thomas McCarran described being shot in the neck and choking on his own blood. Officer John O'Connell told how his arm was shattered by a pistol round in the tiny apartment. Prosecutors argued there was no question Davis shot them and that his intent was murder. They said he fired repeatedly in a room full of family and children, proving reckless disregard for life. They pointed at him across the courtroom, calling him a cold-blooded killer who embarrassed the NYPD. The defense, led by William Kunstler, told a very different story. They said Davis was not trying to kill cops, he was trying to survive an assassination. Kunstler argued the raid on Fulton Avenue was illegal, done without a warrant, and staged to silence him. He told the jury police wanted Davis dead because he knew about corruption in Fort Apache precinct. Larry's mother, Mary Davis, testified that officers threatened her 2 weeks before the raid. She told the jury an officer pushed her and said, "We are going to kill your son." That testimony added weight to the defense claim that police planned an execution, not an arrest. Kunstler used that moment heavily, telling jurors the Davis family had been terrorized before the shootout. In court, prosecutors put Mary Buck, wife of Detective O'Hara, on the stand. She looked at Davis directly and called him an animal for what he had done. That moment shook the jury, but Kunstler turned it by saying the real animals were officers who abused power. He kept hammering on self-defense, saying Davis only fired because officers kicked in a door and stormed the place. The trial dragged for weeks, with New York press covering every word and headline. By closing arguments, the courtroom felt like a stage for a political war between police and community. When the jury finally came back, the verdict sent shockwaves through the city. Davis was found not guilty of attempted murder of all 6 officers. The jury said the prosecution had not proven intent to kill, and self-defense could not be ruled out. The only conviction was on weapons charges, because Davis clearly had illegal firearms that night. For that, he was sentenced to 5 to 15 years, a light outcome compared to what police expected. Officers erupted in outrage, shouting at the jury and storming out of the courtroom. The Police Benevolent Association blasted the verdict as a betrayal, saying Bronx jurors let a cop shooter walk. Meanwhile, Davis supporters outside the courthouse cheered, chanting his name and holding signs calling him a hero. For them, it was a victory against a system that killed Eleanor Bumpers and beat Michael Stewart to death. The split was clear. Cops saw a criminal walking free, while the Bronx saw a man beating the system. The Bronx jury controversy became national news, with pundits debating whether community bias saved Davis. Kunstler himself compared Larry Davis to Bernhard Goetz, the white subway vigilante who shot 4 black teenagers in 1984. Kunstler said if Goetz could claim self-defense against unarmed boys, then Davis could claim it against armed police. The comparison sparked anger, but it stuck in the press and deepened the divide. For Davis, the outcome was another victory, making him look even more untouchable in the eyes of supporters. He walked out of the courtroom smiling. Even though the weapons conviction meant real prison time, the image of him beating 6 attempted murder charges only grew his legend in Bronx hallways. In 1989, Davis went to trial for the Harlem murder of Victor Lagambra. Prosecutors claimed the bullet that killed Lagambra matched Davis's .32 caliber revolver. They said he was part of a robbery crew that stormed Lagambra's apartment and fired when surprised. The defense answered with another alibi, arguing Davis was nowhere near Harlem that night. They said the case was weak, built only on shaky ballistic claims and police pressure. Kunstler again suggested evidence was planted, pointing at the NYPD's anger after losing the cop shooting trial. After testimony and deliberation, the Bronx jury once again returned a not guilty verdict. Davis celebrated in court, while prosecutors buried another embarrassing loss on their record. The win made him look even more like somebody shielded by luck or something larger. By 1991, the state finally landed a conviction against Larry Davis in a murder case. This one was for the August 1986 killing of Bronx dealer Raymond Vizcaino. Prosecutors presented stronger evidence, tying Davis and his brother Eddie directly to the robbery and killing. They said Davis fired through the door during the Webster Avenue shootout, striking Vizcaino fatally. This time, the jury believed the state and returned a guilty verdict. The courtroom erupted when the sentence came down, 25 years to life in prison. Officers in the gallery cheered, finally seeing Davis punished for at least one of the murders. In the courtroom, Davis stayed defiant, yelling at prosecutors and calling the case a setup. He insisted the NYPD had spent years trying to cage him because he knew their secrets. But his words could not change the reality. He was now serving decades behind bars. That conviction ended the run of acquittals and marked the beginning of his long prison stay. For the Bronx, the legend was still alive, but the man was now officially locked away. After his 1991 conviction for the Raymond Vizcaino murder, Larry Davis was shipped upstate to Shawangunk Correctional Facility. Shawangunk was a maximum security prison in Wallkill, New York, known for holding violent offenders with long sentences. Larry was only 25, but he was already infamous, and prison officers treated him like a marked man. His reputation followed him inside, both with correctional staff and other inmates. Life inside was rough because Larry quickly built a record as a disruptive prisoner. Reports later showed he racked up more than 75 infractions during his years behind bars. These included fights with other inmates, assaults on guards, and constant violations of prison rules. He kept the same defiant streak that carried him in courtrooms, but behind the walls it only created more enemies. Some inmates respected him as the guy who shot 6 cops and lived, but others just saw trouble. During his prison years, Larry also went through a religious transformation. He converted to Islam and took the name Adam Abdul Hakim, embracing the faith as a way to steady himself. Muslim communities inside the facility gave him structure, and he often carried himself with a mix of discipline and rebellion. Even with religion guiding him, he still could not fully separate from violence because prison politics were relentless. Every day was survival, and his name always carried weight. Outside prison, hip-hop culture kept Larry Davis's story alive. Artists like KRS-One referenced his case as an example of fighting back against oppression. A Tribe Called Quest mentioned him in conversation around police violence and the Bronx struggles. Years later, 50 Cent told interviewers that Larry's story was legendary in the streets. His name floated in mixtapes, rhymes, and block conversations, making sure new generations heard about him. Larry might have been locked up, but hip-hop turned him into folklore. His life also caught the attention of filmmakers and documentarians who wanted to tell the story. Damon Dash once expressed interest in producing a film based on Davis's saga. Even Robert De Niro was attached to projects that circled around his name, though nothing major ever came out. Documentaries continued to revisit his shootout and trials, painting him as one of the Bronx's most controversial figures. His story fit perfectly into conversations about police corruption, race, and the crack era's destruction. On February 20th, 2008, Larry Davis was killed inside Chawanga Correctional Facility. He was stabbed repeatedly in the yard by another inmate named Luis "Blue Boy" Rosado. Rosado was a former member of the Chingalings motorcycle gang, already known for violent behavior inside. Officials said it was a personal beef that exploded, but rumors immediately started about something bigger. Some believed the stabbing was random, the result of two notorious inmates clashing. Others whispered it was a silencing because Davis still talked about dirty cops and old secrets. No evidence ever confirmed a conspiracy, but the speculation never left conversations in Harlem and the Bronx. His death at 41 closed the book on his life, but it did not close the debate. Larry Davis's funeral was held in Harlem, with crowds of family, friends, and supporters showing up. Some came to honor a brother and son, others to salute a man they called a hero. Critics called him a murderer who got what he deserved, showing how divided his legacy remained. In the end, Larry Davis left the world the same way he lived it, polarizing, defiant, and unforgettable. Larry Davis's story did not fade after his death in 2008. His name kept surfacing in conversations about police corruption, street justice, and the Bronx during the crack era. Supporters pointed to the Mullen Commission reports, which confirmed widespread corruption inside the NYPD. They said his claims about officers arming him and using him were not fantasy, but reality. For them, his shootout was survival against a system that planned to erase him. Police, however, kept his memory in darker terms. To officers, he was a violent criminal who killed and wounded without hesitation. They remembered 6 colleagues shot in Fulton Avenue and saw him only as a cop shooter. His later conviction for the Vizcaino murder proved to them that he was guilty of bloodshed. That side of his legacy always carried weight in official reports and media commentary. Hip-hop, though, carried his legend in a different way. Rappers like KRS-One, A Tribe Called Quest, and later 50 Cent invoked his name. They used him as an example of Bronx resistance, a figure who stood against oppression. His story became a metaphor for survival in a city drowning in corruption and crack. Through music, his name reached audiences far outside New York, turning him into national folklore. Films and documentaries also kept the story alive. Damon Dash pushed to develop a project about his life, and Robert De Niro circled similar interests. Documentaries revisited his trials, framing him as a symbol of the 1980s Bronx. Each one debated whether he was hero or villain, but none denied his impact on culture. The debate over Larry Davis's legacy remains split even now. Some say he was a folk hero who exposed the dirt of New York policing. Others call him a ruthless criminal who destroyed lives and embarrassed a city already bleeding. His funeral in Harlem captured that divide, with mourners praising him while critics dismissed him. His name still sparks arguments wherever the story is told. Larry Davis never lived to see vindication or forgiveness, but his story never disappeared. He became a permanent part of Bronx history, remembered for a night of gunfire and 17 days on the run. Whether seen as a fighter or a killer, his name still carries weight. In the streets, his legend survives because it represents defiance, survival, and the blurred line between hero and villain.